In this brief podcast, we're just going to look at the crises that were created for the Jewish people because of the Babylonian captivity. So, a couple of things happened when, with the destruction of Judah, or the destruction of the southern kingdom, and with people being taken off into exile. First of all, there's a loss of three central um, clues or three central possessions that help to identify Israel's relationship with God. So, one was a loss of land. So, in the Abrahamic covenant, they were promised to possess land. There's a loss of a king, so they no longer have a ruler over them. They're now under the Babylonians. And they lost their temple because the temple was destroyed. So the temple is the symbolic presence of God with his people, and now that temple is gone. So where is God amongst his people? Where is the representation of God's sovereignty over his people when there is no king? And where is the sign of the blessing of the covenant when they don't possess the land? So that's a crisis. There's also a theological crisis of theodicy. So theodicy is basically the understanding of why God permits evil to happen, particularly evil to his people. And so the Jews have to begin to start understanding, uh, how is God just if some of these things are happening to us, and how do we explain God's actions um, in light of a belief in God's justice and God's faithfulness. There's also some issues about ceremonial cleanness because they are in charge of the land, they can mandate, as it were, how things are done in order to keep ceremonially clean, or they should have. And but now the issue is, how are you going to stay clean when you are living amongst an unclean people? How are you going to stay ceremonially pure if you are regularly interacting with um, non-Israelites or non-Jews? And so questions about ceremonial cleanliness come to the forefront, and a concern or an interest about that. We also see the problem of syncretism. So syncretism is where there arises a kind of a melting or a mixing of different ideas and different views. So now the Jews are living under the Babylonians, and then they will be living under the Persians. And what ends up happening is there are aspects of either Babylonian worldviews, Babylonian concepts of what's happening in the heavenly dimension or in the other world, what Persians think about the creation of the world, and what Persians think about what forces are at play. And so some of those values and worldviews get mixed with what the Jewish people had as their kind of narrative of what God was doing, and helps to give new expressions to what it is they believe is taking place in the world. Also, the language of Scripture starts changing, so that since there comes a loss of the Hebrew language, in what language should Scripture be copied in, or what language should be the representation of the divine word? So, language of Scripture is a big change, and also a sense of prophetic silence. So that during this time, there's a sense that there's no really big major prophet who is there speaking on God's behalf to the people. So previously, you have these prophets that are around addressing Israel's sinfulness, but now where are those prophets? And so, what's the Jewish people to do to ascertain God's will, besides the study of the Scripture? So you can read Scripture, but is there no person speaking on God's behalf? So these are some of the things that takes place after Judah's destruction, and are some of the things which, um, as as the people begin to formulate their faith, are things they're working on, things that they begin to address. And so that's very briefly just a little bit about the crises of the 6th century.